love to have a discussion about this is, do you really want corporations to police what's true and not true?
Hello, my internet friends. So occasionally I watch Joe Rogan, and I've also been known to watch Tim Pool on occasion. So when the two got together and had a discussion with Jack Dorsey and Vijaya Gadde from Twitter, I found the exchange very interesting, and it had a lot of information in it that I wanted to go over. Now, before I actually get into the exchange, I need to point out first that this is very heavily edited, so keep that in mind. This was an almost 3.5-hour broadcast, so for time's sake, I cut a lot out. So I'm not going to say there's no bias in the cuts, I did try to avoid that for the most part, but be aware that it is very heavily cut. So I recommend watching the entire thing over on Joe's channel.
Your rules, Tim, what do you mean by that?
Dead naming and misgendering.
Dead naming and misgendering.
Yeah. That's a specific ideology that's unique to a very small faction of people in this world that you guys actually ban people for.
So the way I think of it is it's behavior based. And I know you think of it as content, and we can disagree on this point. But this is about, why are you doing this to a trans person? Why are you calling them by this name when they've chosen to go by a different name? Or why are you outing them in some way? Like, what is your intent and purpose behind that?
Now, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of just break this down a little bit and give some explanation here. So what Tim is saying is that Twitter is banning people for what they call a particular behavior, but what he is saying is it's not necessarily a behavior, but it's an ideology. And he's brought this up on his channel before, but let me kind of explain how this is an ideology. So let's say I believe that the sex that you're born with is your actual sex. And if you were born, say, a male, you cannot change to become a female just because you want to. Now, according to Twitter, I have to acknowledge that you are actually a female because you say you are. Now, let's say my perspective is, if I acknowledge that you are a female, that is harmful to you because now I am agreeing to your delusion. I am aiding you in a fantasy, which down the road will be even more harmful. So we have two clashing ideas here of what is harmful and what isn't. Twitter has one, I have another. And let's just say one is based in more science and the other one is more based in feeling. I'll give you a hint. Twitter is based more on feeling than it actually is in science.
So it was something that's broad-based, is that you can't choose to attack people because of these characteristics.
But you do have limits on what characteristics you police, right? So you're not banning people for targeted trans-speciesing others, right?
Well, we have also general abuse and harassment rules, right? Which says you can't engage in abuse and harassment on the platform.
But you can't detonate someone, but you can call them stupid.
Generally, I mean, if you created an account that only was there to call the same person stupid 5,000 times, we'd probably view that as
targeted harassment.
Right.
It's a function of behavior, like because people with our system can do this in massive velocity.
So
which would ultimately silence you from the platform, or just say, like, I give up, I don't want to deal with this thing, I'm out.
One really important thing that needs to be stated is that Twitter, by definition, is a biased platform in favor of the left, period. It's not a question. I understand you might have your own interpretation, but it's very simple. Conservatives do not agree with you on the definition of misgendering. If you have a rule in place that specifically adheres to the left ideology, you, by default, are enforcing rules from a biased perspective.
So in a nutshell here, Team Twitter is saying that their policies are designed to prevent harassment, which is all well and good. But what Tim points out is that their definitions of harassment are arbitrary and based on their own ideology, and actually do target specific groups in and of themselves.
As a high level, I personally, and this is my job to run the policy team, I believe that everyone has a voice and should be able to use it. And I want them to be able to use it online. Now, where we draw a line is when people use their voice and use their platform to abuse and harass other people to silence them. because I think that that's what we've seen over the years is a number of people who have been silenced online because of the abuse and harassment they've received, and they either stop talking or they leave the platform in its entirety. If you look at free expression and free speech laws around the world, they're not absolute. They're not absolute. There's always limitations on what you can say, and it's when you're starting to endanger other people.
I guess there's the obvious question of why does it always feel like your policies are going one direction politically? You say it's about behavior. You said it several times already. But I've got tons of examples of that not being the case.
And you will always be able to find those examples.
Yeah, examples where you guys were alerted multiple times and did nothing. Like when Antifa doxed a bunch of law enforcement agents, some of the tweets were removed, but since September, this tweet is still live with a list of private phone numbers, addresses, yet Kathy Griffin, she's fine. The guy who threatened the lives of these kids in Covington and said, lock them in the school and burn it down, you did nothing.
I have to say, I was very surprised at how underprepared I think Vijaya was for some of the examples that Tim brought. Tim has been very vocal on his channel about different examples of Twitter violations and how he thought they were biased, and they're very easy to find. Again, he is definitely not hiding any of these examples, and he brings them up multiple times. And the fact that Vijaya was not aware of some of the things that he brought, or at least she said she wasn't aware, I found very surprising, because I thought she would have had everything ready to go and be prepared to basically address everything that he has talked about in the past.
What did you guys do with Kathy Griffin when she was saying she wanted the names of those young kids wearing the MAGA hats at the Covington High School kids?
Yeah, that's a great example, Joe. So in that particular case, our doxing policy really focuses on posting private information, which we don't consider names to be private. We consider your home address, your home phone number, your mobile phone number, those types of things to be private. So in that particular case, we took what I think now is probably a very literal interpretation of our policy and said that that was not a doxing incident.
Do you think that was an error?
I think that it was short-sighted, and given the context of what was going on there, that if I was doing this all over again, I would probably ask my team to look at that through the lens of what was the purpose behind that tweet. And if the purpose was, in fact, to identify these kids to either dox them or abuse and harass them, which it probably was, then we should be taking a more expansive view of that policy and including that type of content.
Now, this response, I think, really exposes the bias of Twitter. So in this example, Vijaya says that they took Kathy Griffith's tweet and took the most liberal interpretation of the policy and applied it. Now, you see later on with more specific examples that Tim brings up that when it's an ideology or a person that does not align with the political ideology that Twitter kind of pushes, that the interpretation that they take is much more liberal. And we'll see that again in some of those specific examples coming up. But back to Covington, Vijaya basically says that in hindsight, they could have done things different, but things were done. Again, when you compare the results of what they did to some other situations, it was a very, very light-handed approach. Now, she defends it in just a second here.
Too, though. Right.
But Tim, those accounts were actioned. They may not have been actioned the way you wanted to, but the tweets were forced to be deleted, and the account took a penalty for that. So
I understand that.
What kind of a penalty?
Well, again, as I said earlier, Joe, we don't usually automatically suspend accounts with one violation because we want people to learn. We want people to understand what they did wrong and give them an opportunity not to do it again.
Right.
And it's a big thing to kick someone off the platform.
And now we get to what I think most people tuning in have been waiting for.
So let's preface that by saying the point I want to make sure is clear is that you had somebody who actively called for the death of people. I understand the context issue. Maybe he's talking about video games.
Context and scale.
And scale. So this is a verified user.
And that's just the complexity in acting. It's not an excuse for why we didn't do it in a particular time.
Right.
But and then when
there are a lot of other examples too that get into more egregious areas that I've prepared. So here we have someone with over 20,000 followers. He's verified numerous times, incites his followers to commit a crime against these kids. The action taken against him is delete the tweets, you get a suspension, you get timeout. Then you have people like Alex Jones, who berated a CNN reporter, permanently banned. You get Milo Yiannopoulos, he was mean, permanently banned.
Now, before we continue, I have to mention that for the following examples of people that have been banned from Twitter, I do not condone the things that they say. Now, I do recognize their rights to say them, but they don't reflect my own opinions or ideas. That said, let's take a look at Milo Yiannopoulos. Now, Milo was banned, and the reasons that Vijaya gave for banning Milo were threefold. So first, they said that he had violated their terms of service by saying that he worked for BuzzFeed. Now, I was a little confused on that because I thought the violation wasn't a strike against him, but it did remove his verification, which they did do, and they removed that for not following that policy. The second one was for doxing. Now, if he did in fact dox somebody, clear example of a violation, end of story. Now, these last sections, this is where things get a little interesting. The reasons they gave for the third violation.
He tweeted to somebody else, if you were my child, I'd have dashed your head on a rock and tried again, which we viewed as a threat.
That seems like he's saying, like, your mom should have swallowed you. You know, it's like, you know what I'm saying? He's like, you're a mistake. I don't
totally.
think that's a threat.
I understand why reasonable people would have different impressions of this. I'm just going through and telling you what they are, just so we can have all the facts on the table, and then we can debate them. And then the last one, we found a bunch of things that he posted that we viewed as incitement of abuse against Leslie Jones. So there's a bunch of them, but the one that I like to look at, which really convinced me, is he posted 2 doctored tweets that were supposedly by Leslie Jones. They were fake tweets. The first one said, white people are getting on my nerves, like, how can you call yourself human? And then the second one said, the goddamn slur for a Jewish person at Sony ain't paid me yet. Damn, Bix nude better pay up.
So this was just a fake tweet that someone had photoshopped?
Two fake
tweets.
Fake tweets. And we know they were faked because we could still tell from the software that they were faked. You can't always tell.
So it is possible that he didn't know they were faked?
It's possible.
That someone sent it to him and he didn't do his due diligence and looking it up. And
it is possible, but it was pointed out to him that they were fake because...
And he left it on?
And not only did he leave it on, he said, don't tell me some mischievous internet rascal made them up, ! So this in the context of a bunch of other things he was saying towards Leslie Jones on Twitter, I and my team felt that this was taken as a whole incitement of harassment against her.
So here's where we go back to my point of literal interpretation of policy versus liberal interpretation of policy. So in this case, Vijaya actually admits that the threat of violence may not necessarily be considered a threat of violence. And listening to what she's read, yes, it's disgusting. Is it a threat of violence? No, he's not saying, I will beat you up, or telling somebody to go beat somebody up. He's basically saying, I wish you weren't born. That is not a threat of violence. The second thing that she brings up, I don't even understand how that is against a policy. So he posts a fake tweet. As Joe points out, he doesn't necessarily even know that this is a fake tweet. If somebody says, hey, that's a fake tweet, that doesn't mean that you recognize that it is in fact a fake tweet. It just says that somebody is telling you, or they think that it's a fake tweet. So I'm not sure how that applies. And into the larger scale, at no point in that tweet did he tell anybody to go out and harass Leslie Jones. He's saying this is a tweet that I believe that she sent out. And again, this doesn't defend him. It's simply saying that the policy is not being equally applied.
No, I'm just going to be honest. When I'm listening to those, or listening to you read those tweets out, they don't sound that bad. And they certainly don't sound as bad as calling for the death of a child who's wearing a MAGA hat, throw him into a wood chipper. The fact that that guy's still out there tweeting, and yet Milo's not. Milo's initial, the whole thing stemmed from, other than the BuzzFeed thing, stemmed from his legitimate criticism of a film. And he's a satirist. He was mocking this film.
I don't agree with Joe Rogan a lot, but I have to say he does have a very good BS detector, and he is very good at pointing out hypocrisy.
but what about Chuck Johnson? Why was Chuck Johnson banned?
I don't have those details in front of me, Tim.
Chuck Johnson said that he was preparing something to take out DeRay McKesson. And in a journalistic context, people take this to mean he was going to do a dossier or some kind of hit piece on DeRay. He was permanently banned. And my understanding, and it's been a long time since I've read this, there was some leaked emails, I think, from Dick Costolo, where he said, maybe it wasn't Dick, I don't want to drag Dick. I don't know who it was exactly. They said, I don't care, just get rid of him. And he was off. So you have, and again, maybe there's some hidden context there, I don't know. But on the surface,
the concern is that this is always leaning towards the left.
Oh, it absolutely is, and I'm not even getting started.
Once again, very surprised that neither Jack nor Vijaya was prepared for this, since this is another example that Tim has brought up on his podcast before.
Yeah.
I can understand why you feel that way. I don't think that's true. I think we look at each individual instance of violations of our rules and try to make the best case that we can.
Right,
and I'm not trying, and I do think, Joe, just to say, I do think we've failed in a couple of ways, and I want to admit that.
In general, things lean far more left. Would you agree to that?
I don't know what that means.
But in this particular case, it's how the speech is being used. This is a new vector of attack that people have felt that I don't want to be on this platform anymore because I'm being harassed and abused and I need to get the hell out.
Well, people harass and abuse me all day and night. You don't do anything about that. My notifications permanently locked at 99. You have it worse than I do. I mean, you got substantially more followers. And I don't click the notification tab anymore because it's basically just harassment.
Now, this exchange was very telling. Joe and Tim are basically going back to this idea that the policy around harassment is not being equally applied. And Jack didn't have an answer for that.
So why did you ban Alex Jones? Let me say this. The reason I bring him up is that Oliver Dorsey, one of the lead reporters covering Alex Jones and his content, said on CNN that it was only after media pressure did these social networks take action. So that's why I bring him up specifically, because it sort of implies you were under PR constraints to get rid of him.
What was it that made you ban him?
So there were 3 separate incidents that came to our attention after the fact that were reported to us by different users. There was a video that was uploaded that showed a child being violently thrown to the ground and crying. The second one was a video that we viewed as incitement of violence. I can read it to you. It's a little bit of a transcript, but now it's time to act on the enemy before they do a false flag. I know the Justice Department's crippled a bunch of followers and cowards, but there's groups, there's grand juries, there's you called for it. It's time politically, economically, and judiciously, and legally, and criminally to move against these people. It's got to be done now. Get together the people you know aren't traitors, aren't cowards, aren't helping their frickin' bets, hedging their frickin' bets like all these other assholes do, and let's go, let's do it. So people need to have their, and then there's a bunch of other stuff, but at the end, so people need to have their battle rifles ready and everything ready at their bedsides, and you've got to be ready because the media is so disciplined in their deception. And that felt like it was an incitement to violence.
So if he only tweeted the incitement to violence, he would have been fine?
If he only
tweeted that posted that transcript saying, get your battle rifles ready, you wouldn't have deleted his account.
Again, context matters to him. It's not about one thing. So we'd have to look at the entire context of what's going on.
So I'm asking, was that egregious enough for you to say that alone?
That wasn't
just number 2.
Right. So then I guess the question is, what was the video context of the kid being thrown to the ground? Was it newsworthy?
We obviously didn't think so, and depicting violence against a child is not something that we would allow on the platform.
Even if it's news content?
If it was, there are certain types of situations where if you were reporting on, war zone and things that might be happening, we would put an interstitial on that type of content that's graphic or violent, but we didn't feel that was the context here.
Well, there's a video that's been going around, that was going around 4 or 5 weeks ago, the one where the girls were yelling at that big giant guy and the guy punched that girl in the face and she was like 11 years old. I saw that multiple times on Twitter. That was one of the most violent things I've ever seen. This giant man punched this 11-year-old girl in the face. Mm-hmm. And that was that removed from Twitter?
I don't know. I would have to go see if anyone reported it to us.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the issues here is do you
want me to get to the third one?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So the third strike that we looked at was a verbal altercation that Alex got into with a journalist, and in that altercation, which was uploaded to Twitter, there were a number of statements using "eyes of the rat," even more evil-looking person. He is just scum. You're a virus to America and freedom. Smelling like a possum that climbed out of the rear end of a dead cow. You look like a possum that got caught doing some really, really nasty stuff, in my view. So it was a bunch of
That's
verbal.
enough? Really? That's hilarious.
Pattern and practice, but it
I
was a
understand.
verbal altercation that was posted on our
Right.
platform.
So
So let's break all this down. Why was Alex Jones banned? Well, first, we have a video depicting violence against a child. Now, we don't have the context of that video, and as Joe points out, this policy is not being evenly applied because you can see videos worse than it throughout the platform. Number two is an incitement to violence, which at no point did he actually call anyone to violence. They are simply interpreting his words as was that he said some mean things to somebody else on the platform, which they previously said was not necessarily against their terms of service. You would have to go on and call somebody something 5,000 times to consider it harassment.
But ultimately, your judgment is the context. You say we have to pay attention to the context. We're just trusting that you made the right decision.
Well, I'm giving you as much facts as I can give you here, and I think that this is a real hard part of content moderation at scale.
Your platform restricts speech,
Our platform promotes speech unless people violate our rules
and in a specific direction.
in any direction.
But I don't want to say his name, the guy who calls for death gets a suspension. The guy who insinuates death gets a permanent ban.
And good for Tim for really holding their feet to the fire and calling out the hypocrisy. He's not letting them go with just, hey, this is a hard job. He's really pushing that this is a very hypocritical stance. And on such an influential platform, this can be very damaging.
I understand, but you essentially created a protected class if this is the case, because despite these studies and what these studies are showing, there's a gigantic suicide rate amongst trans people, period. It's a 40%. It's outrageously large. Now, whether that is because of gender dysphoria, whether that is because of the complications from sexual surgery, sexual transition surgery, whether it's because of bullying, whether it's because of this awful feeling of being born in the wrong gender, whether that all that is yet to be determined. Mm-hmm. The fact that they've shown that there's a large amount of trans people that are committing suicide, I don't necessarily think that makes sense in terms of people from someone's perspective, like a Ben Shapiro, saying that if you are biologically female, if you are born with a double X chromosome, you will never be XY. If he says that, that's a violation of your policy. If your standards and your policies are not biologically accurate, then you're dealing with an ideological policy.
You have an argument between two people.
Again,
and you have a rule that enforces only one side of the ideology, and you've banned only one of those people.
We have a rule that attempts to address what we have perceived to be instances of abuse and harassment. I understand why people would not agree with the rule, but that being said, it is a rule on our platform, and once you're warned about the rule, to repeatedly post the same content is also going to be a violation of our rules.
Right, but the rule, this seems like a good example of an ideologically based rule. If she's saying that a man is never a woman, though, that is not in that context harassment. That is a very specific opinion that she has that happens to be biologically accurate. Now, I don't agree with targeting harassment on anybody, and I targeted harassment on trans people or straight people or whatever. I don't agree with it. I don't think you should do it. It's not something I want to do. But in this context, what she's saying is not just her expression, but it's accurate.
I think an important point is if I tweeted to you, Joe, you are not a hamster. That's clearly not a violation of the rules. However, if
I identify as a hamster.
Well, no, it wouldn't be clear because I know people who have specifically begun using insults of animals to avoid getting kicked off the platform for breaking the rules. Certain individuals who have been suspended now use certain small woodland creatures in place of slurs, so they're not really insulting you, and it's fine. But there are people who consider themselves trans species. Now, I'm not trying to belittle the trans community by no means. I'm just trying to point out that you have a specific rule for one set of people, and there are people who have general body dysphoria. You don't have rules on that. There are people who have actually amputated their own arms. You don't have rules on that. You have a very specific rule set. And more importantly, in the context of a targeted conversation, I can say a whole bunch of things that would never be considered a rule break but that one is, which is ideologically driven.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback. I mean, we're again always learning and trying to understand different people's perspectives. And all I'll say is that our intent is not to police ideology. Our intent is to police behaviors that we view as abusive and harassment. And I hear your point of view, and it's something that I'll definitely discuss with my team.
So we've returned again to the transgender issue, and it's really just because it's the most egregious example of how ideologically driven their policies are. And I think it's very telling how Vijaya, in the end, really didn't have an answer for it anymore. She's tried to come up with different excuses, but ultimately, there's no reason other than this is the way they feel, and so this is how they're going to apply their policies.
Okay, but doesn't that seem like you're throwing a blanket over a very small issue?
I think
because learn to code in itself is very small. The blanket is cast over racism. The blanket is cast over this all the other horrible things that are attached to it. But the horrible things that are attached to it are the real issue. This learn to code thing is kind of a legitimate protest in people saying that these minors should learn to code. That's kind of preposterous.
Well, so now we get into the learn to code controversy, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to give a quick recap on that. So a couple years ago, a bunch of coal miners were losing their jobs, and reporters were basically telling them, hey, you should go learn to code, go learn software coding so you'd have a career. Well, last year and into this year, many journalists have found themselves without a job, and in rebuttal to kind of this very ignorant idea that these coal miners should learn to code, people were tweeting out, learn to code, back to these journalists. Twitter subsequently started banning these individuals or suspending accounts because they posted learn to code. And the reason given was that some of these learn to code tweets also had threats and other incitements in them. However, other individuals just posting learn to code were also suspended.
It was a meme. The hashtag, the idea of learn to code, condenses this idea, and it's easy to communicate, especially when you only have 280 characters, that there is a class of individual in this country. I think you mentioned on, was it Sam Harris, that these liberal journalists only follow each other?
Yeah, in the run-up to the 2016 elections.
Yeah, and so, I still believe that to be true, and I've worked in these offices.
It has changed. They've done the study again, the visualization, and now there is a lot more cross-pollination. But what we saw is folks who were reporting on the left end of the spectrum mainly followed folks on the left, and folks on the right followed everyone.
Right. What you were talking about earlier, that there's these bubbles.
There's bubbles, and we've helped create them and maintain them.
So here's what ends up happening, and this is one of the big problems that people have with this story particularly. You have a left-wing activist who works for NBC News. I'm not accusing you of having read the article. He spends like a day lobbying to Twitter saying, guys, you have to do this, you have to make these changes. The next day he writes a story saying that 4chan is organizing these harassment campaigns and death threats. And while 4chan was doing threads about it, you can't accuse 4chan simply for talking about it because Reddit was talking about it too, as was Twitter. So then the next day, after he published his article, now he's getting threats. And then Twitter issues a statement saying, we will take action. And to make matters worse, when John Levine, a writer for The Wrap, got a statement from one of your spokespeople saying, yes, we are banning people for saying learn to code.
Oh, there for sure probably mistakes in there. I don't think that any of us are claiming that we got this 100% right.
And probably our team having a lack of context into actually what's happening as well. And we would fully admit we probably were way too aggressive when we first saw this as well and made mistakes.
And these views are becoming more pervasive. So what ends up happening is you have a journalist who clearly holds these views. I don't even want to call him a journalist. He writes extremely biased and out of context story. Twitter takes action in response, seemingly in response. Then we can look at what happens with Oliver Dorsey at CNN. He says, the people at CPAC the conservatives are gullible, eating red meat from grifters, among other things, disparaging comments about the right. And he's the one who's primarily advocating for the removal of certain individuals who you then remove. And then when Kathy Griffin calls for doxing, that's fine. When this guy calls for the death of these kids, he gets a slap on the wrist. And look, I understand the context matters, but grains of sand make a heap. And eventually you have all of these stories piling up. And people are asking you why it only flows in one direction. Because I got to be honest. I'd imagine that calling for the death 3 times of any individual is a bannable offense, even without a warning. You just get rid of them. But it didn't happen, right? We see these, people say men aren't women though, and they get a suspension. We see people say the editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller may be the best example. Hashtag learn to code, quoting the Daily Show, and he gets a suspension. Threatening death and inciting death is a suspension too. It feels like it's only going in one direction.
So Tim's point here is that it, at least from the outside, appears that a journalist was able to get people removed from Twitter, so have their opinions banned because he didn't like what they were saying. So because people were saying learn to code and he didn't like that, he didn't appreciate that, somebody who has actively shown his own bias is getting people removed from this platform.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do to explain more clearly when we're taking action and why, and certainly looking into any mistakes we may have made in those particular situations.
Is that I think a lot of people that are on the right feel disenfranchised by these platforms that they use on a daily basis.
So there's a couple things to get out of this exchange. The first is that it is nice to see Team Twitter acknowledge that mistakes were made and things could have been done differently. I do think that they keep coming back to this idea that they need to explain policy better. Well, that is definitely important, and a lot of people have been banned not knowing what the policy is and not knowing why they're being banned. But if the policy itself is bias, then explaining the policy really only shows how biased it is. It doesn't change the policy at all. And then the second part, Joe brings up a really good point. And throughout this interview or this exchange here, Twitter has been leaning on this idea that the reasons they have these policies are to keep people on the platform. They don't want people to leave because of harassment and these situations like that. However, if your policies are biased and they are unequally affecting a particular ideology, that's driving those people away from the platform. So you're protecting one group while you're pushing away another much, much larger group. So it doesn't make a lot of sense logically.
And Twitter permanently excised anyone associated with the Proud Boys, Antifa accounts who have broken the rules repeatedly, branded known cells that have been involved in violence, all still active. Is there a reason?
Well, with the Proud Boys, what we were able to do was actually look at documentation and announcements that the leaders of that organization had made and their use of violence in the real world. So that was what we were focused on. And subsequent to our decision, I believe the FBI also designated them.
That's not true.
It's not true?
That's not true.
No.
I just take the advice of the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Do we take the advice of them?
So it's widely circulated. The SPLC lobbies various social platforms to ban certain people. They advise. It's been reported they advised YouTube, as does the Anti-Defamation League. Do you use them in your decision-making process, rule development?
We're very aware of flaws with certain of their research, and we're very careful about who we take advice from.
But do you take advice from them?
I think that they have certainly reached out to our team members, but there's certainly nothing definitive that we take from them.
We don't take direction.
You never take an action based on information received from them?
No.
So I wanted to end on these two clips in particular because I think they really drive home the narrative that Tim is really setting here. Vijaya is acknowledging that part of the decision to ban the Proud Boys was based on false information. The FBI has never labeled the Proud Boys a hate group or a terrorist organization. That was, as people say, fake news. Now remember, part of the reason why Milo was removed from the platform was because he also disseminated fake news. So again, a little bit of hypocrisy here. That also means that really they could use false information like this to ban anybody. So any fake news story could be used as an excuse to ban anybody from the platform. Now you'll also notice in the other part of that clip is when it comes to the SPLC, they never deny that the SPLC has no part in decision making and policy making, only specifically action. That to me is terrifying because the SPLC is a legitimate hate group. And that is not even a controversy. That is a statement of fact. The SPLC targets individuals and groups based on their own ideology, not on any particular metric of what a hate group is or not. And the idea that that group has any involvement whatsoever in any aspect of decision making should terrify anybody. So this video has already gone extremely long, and I apologize for that, but as I said, there was a lot of information, and again, this was an almost 3.5 hour podcast, so there's a lot more in there that I didn't even touch on. So hopefully you'll go watch that over on Joe's channel. And ultimately, what I think is going to come out of this is I don't think there will be any significant changes. Let's be honest here. However, I do think Joe and Tim were very good in expressing an idea and showing specific examples of how Twitter actually is biased. Now, is that going to translate to any kind of change or anything? Maybe, but most likely not. But at least it shows why we think there's an issue here. And hopefully they'll take that to heart. And hopefully there will be changes, and not just to express why they do what they do, but to actually address the underlying problem of the bias in general. Again, I hope you liked the video, and if you do, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, tell your friends, get them on the channel too, and I'll be making more videos, and I'll talk to you soon.
I just want to clarify, like I don't know if we're going around saying we're necessarily doing the right thing. We're saying why we're doing what we're doing.